Hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining us on day 2 of the conference. We're broadcasting live from Seoul, Korea, and we have yet another very global session with participants from all around the world. We have 3 more sessions to get through today, so we'll get right into it. The topic of session 4 is diverse approaches to harmony with nature and their relationship with peace and development. And the moderator is Thu Sat, Professor of Law at Aji University of Korea. He's here in the studio with us. And the presenters are Anna Griching, Senior Research Fellow, Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security, University of Vermont. She's joining us from Geneva. We also have Klaus Bosselman, Professor, University of Auckland, New Zealand, and also Lak Hyun Kim, Assistant Professor, Utrecht University, the Netherlands. And from Cyprus, we have Kostas Konstantinou, Professor of International Relations, University of Cyprus. We also have Chun-Soo Kim, researcher at KAIST. And last, we have Chae-Wan Lim, Chairperson of Korea Public Policy Association. Professor Oh, we're ready when you are.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and greetings to you all in your regions. The session 4 allows us to talk about the diverse approaches to harmony with nature and their relationship with peace and development. My name is Oh Dong-seok. I teach law at Aji University, Constitution Law. And I also a member of People for Earth. In the division of Earth Earth law that I am part of the People for Earth. During this forum that we are privileged by the important speakers, and this forum is co-organized by the UNRISD and also People for Earth. And the main organizer is Gangwon-do province and Cheorwon County. And through this YouTube channel, this forum is lively broadcast to you. And it is being recorded at the moment. So if you'd like to catch up with the forum, that you can go back and also watch the previous forums and previous sessions. Ladies and gentlemen who are joining us through the online channels, that you can join us by leaving comments or give us your questions. So at the end of the presentations that we're going to have your questions covered. And also you can join us by showing your support by clicking the like channel. So by seeing the number of your likes, that we can tell how you liked our presentation. And at the end of the channel, that the screen that you will see the survey form. So after listening to the presentation, I would appreciate if you could give us the feedback. We had the first session that we talked about the border and borderland and the activities and about the humans who live near the borderlands. And just right before the fourth session, in the third session, we talked about harmony with nature. In the third session, we talked about various subjects in terms of Earth jurisprudence. And in the fourth session, we are going to talk more in detail. The forum name is DEEPEN, DEEPEN. Deepen means literally we aim to deepen the discussions and the relations among countries, and also our relations with the nature, that you can feel that our discussions have deepened through this forum by taking various approaches that we're going to share wonderful insights. And we are privileged to have 6 speakers here in this 4th session. And throughout our discussions, we're going to talk about biocracy, which is combined and which is slightly different from democracy. So we'll talk about governance and political system and how we have to turn our international organizations system. So we will be privileged to learn from speakers from various perspectives. That we have 6 speakers, and we're going to invite the speakers to give their presentations. Your presentation should be 13 minutes, maximum 15 minutes. I'm sure that 13 minutes to 15 minutes are too limited to you, and I'm so sorry to give you only limited time, but we'd like to have Q&A session after all presentations, so please understand that. And participants can see the detailed profile of the speakers on our webpage, forum webpage. Now, I'd like to begin by introducing the first speaker, Ms. Anna Gruiching. She is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security at University of Vermont. Dr. Gruiching has published many articles and books. And I think it's quite interesting to note that she is architect and also she's a musician. Dr. Gruiching has her own website, and if you visit her website, then you can see that she has such a beautiful voice. So please visit the website. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Gruiching to hear her presentation. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. And also for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers. And I was very honored to meet Ms. Kum Sil Kang and People for Earth in February, where we participated in the Peace Forum. And we also organized a session with Geneva Peace Week just recently. So I'm going to talk from a spatial perspective as an architect and urbanist about co-creating peace with nature in the DMZ and looking at other cases worldwide on borders. So the context of 2020, aside from obviously the COVID and the pandemic, which has transformed even our borders, is the 75 years of the United Nations, the 70 years of the Korean War, and the 30 years of German reunification. So it is a very special year also as concerns conflict and borders. Here, as we can see, the UN is also present in the DMZ, in the Panmunjom Joint Security Area, which is sort of one of the only places where there's a real connection. Here we can see the view from the south and from the north, and the 70 years of the Korean War and the division of the peninsula. So this is a spatial representation also of the military infrastructures. So on the one hand, there's this military situation. On the other hand, nature, as we know, which has sort of regenerated this space between the two Koreas and the adjoining spaces, and that's what we're interested in. So the 30 years of reunification of Germany is interesting also as a precedent. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is the German and the European Green Belt. So this is a project actually that was initiated by nature lovers on both sides of the German border, and then became actually a national project in Germany with Green Berlin. So one of the, I'm going to talk a few concepts that I work with, but I won't go into detail because I have very little time. But one is social ecologies and borderlands. So it's really the socio-ecological approaches for co-creating shared spaces. shift towards human-centered conservation practices with the inclusion and empowerment of human communities. So I published a book as well with Michel Zebisch-Knoss about this, with very different case studies around the world. This is from one of the chapters, Social Ecology and Transboundary Conservation, but just shows the evolving paradigms of, this making peace with nature, how it's evolved from nature, from itself, to really people and nature. And I think we're going to hear a lot in this panel about how that is being taken forward into governance and policy. And really this idea we're going beyond the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene is really where we are at the top of the pyramid, and the new future vision with more earth-centric laws is that we are part of the ecosystem. And I think also this pandemic has revealed the importance of this. So here also this eco-diplomacy, the E is also about sort of digital, because of course the digital as we see today is very important. So cultural, scientific, environmental, citizen and digital diplomacy, inclusive peace building, and also the role of women, which is very important. As mentioned by Ban Ki-moon, it's really important to include all communities and especially women's groups. And just to remind us that Wangari Maathai was the first person to win a Nobel Peace Prize that was associating peace and the environment. And this was the Green Belt movement with women in Kenya. And what's interesting is it was then actually translated from a Peace Prize into public policy for an atlas of ecosystems and human well-being in Kenya. And also women, and this is the Women's Federation of World Peace, who were actually meeting with women on both sides of the border in Korea. So these are also very important initiatives and inclusive initiatives. So obviously this co-creation means that the act of healing is also the co-creation is also the act of healing the conflict. And co-creating peace also with nature, so amongst people, but also between people and nature. And the idea is to transform from this deep wound to a beautiful scar. Another concept is biocultural diversity. We talk obviously a lot about biodiversity, and biocultural diversity has been developed by UNESCO. So it's really the synergy between the cultural and the biological diversity, which is really important to reconcile and restore them. So I won't go into these concepts very much, but you can find a lot about them in UNESCO. But it also means that that we have to re-articulate them together. And as we can see, it's also to do with socio-ecological adaptive systems, where we have biology and ecology, culture and languages, and also obviously spiritual beliefs. And what drives the changes in these? These are some examples from UNESCO on a border. These UNESCO transboundary heritage sites, which are biocultural hotspots, which we could probably see the DMZ as well. So this involves a multi-scalar approach at very different levels of stakeholders, and also very different spatial scale. So obviously here we see the different tracks of diplomacy involving different communities, but it's also important obviously to look at the different scales that we're working at, whether they're spatial or even temporal, historical and institutional. This is an example from Cyprus, where we can see the different scales from the regional scale and obviously the role of Greece and Turkey and Britain and the UN, all the way down to the parcels in the historic city that you can see where, and obviously there are property owners, etc. So it's very important to have this multi-scalar approach. So as I said, I won't go too much into these, but the time scale and historical context are also important. So buffers, this is sort of the spatial context that we're looking at, buffer zones. And the idea is that a buffer zone is a physical area to separate, but in environmental concept, it's a protection. You have it, buffer zones to protect ecological reserves. And in information technology, it's a memory, it's to store a memory. So the idea is really that we want to articulate this transformation from the military buffer to the environmental, but also to create a space a space of memory. So as Robert Schuman said, borders are the scars of history. And the idea is, how do we make a beautiful scar and not erase the scar? So this is a map I made of of historical borders and existing borders or future borders. And we know that they will all eventually fall, in the long view of history. So as I mentioned before here, the German Green Belt was initiated by local NGOs and environmental NGOs. And the idea is to make this, you would be able to cycle along the patrol path, which is common to all these walls and buffer zones, is having this patrol path. So this is sort of a necklace, that can tie together all these cultural hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, etc. There's actually a guide, and this was supported by Michael Kramer, who was an EU MP, and also at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was, proposed, there was this idea of having green share certificates to become shareholders in the Green Belt. And also because obviously there are landowners and owners in some cases, the land had to be brought to be able to conserve it. So here we have also in the Green Belt, a memorial for the veterans. This is between the Soviet-Finnish War, but the idea is also the commemoration, the landscapes of memory. We have many different people and victims. They can be from both sides, but also international, as in the Korean War. And I was listening actually to the opening statements yesterday, and there has been work of also unearthing still, victims in the DMZ, which can be from China, Koreans, even from America, even journalists. So the idea is how we can create also these landscapes of memory. And these are not nationalistic symbols, but more really inclusive memory. So the Berlin Wall is where I started my work on borders. And here we can see outside the city, one of these, part of the death strip that was transformed into a sort of haven of biodiversity. But in the center of the city, the forces of real estate very quickly erased the walls. So we had to create a line to say this is where the wall was, because the space disappeared. This was a project that I developed at the time for the Berlin Wall as a sort of ecological and memory space. But some spaces survived, and these were actually initiatives by communities on both sides of the wall. So a bottoms-up initiative that was then taken on by the government, and they created the Mauer Park, which is a very active and vibrant park in an area of the city where there was very little open spaces. These are actually temporary spaces because there was sort of an economic slowdown, so the development didn't continue. So in the center of the city, this became a sort of temporary sculpture park. So it's very interesting to see how we can have temporary uses while we're also waiting for the long term. So here you can see the death strip. And here this was actually an eco-community that was enabled to stay in this part of the death strip where they're really a sort of autonomous, art and ecology community. So a sort of a prototype of other ways of living. So now we're going to look at Cyprus. So this is an event I organized for the 20 years of German Unity, where I made a presentation with the German embassy on the German Green Belt. So looking at this as a sort of inspiration of what could be done with the buffer zone in Cyprus. And here we can see, we will hear more about Cyprus. So I'm not going to talk about the political context, but really more the spatial context of this green line. Here, this is a mapping of how it links other protected areas or green areas in Cyprus and runs through the historic cities, and was also crossed by many rivers or winter rivers, as we call them. And so it's also a connector of other preserved or natural hotspots. So here we can see a comparison between the DMZ and the Cyprus buffer zone. Here, there's also on the bottom is the sort of territorial adjustments, the sort of political and the crossing points of the future solution. And above is some of the scenarios that could be imagined for different areas and hotspots along the green line, going from marine nature reserves, copper mine remediation, organic farming, eco museums, archaeological villages, wetland restoration, the Green Line heritage in Nicosia, etc. So here we can actually see the green line between north and south with all the agricultural lands, and you can see that actually there's very little or at least no farming, and so certain areas have been left to go back to nature. So the idea is here is to have ecotourism, organic farming, etc. So the idea is not to freeze this into a green zone, but just to create a more ecological use of the area. And there has been studies of biodiversity. I actually went in 2006 and met Michael Muller at the time, who was the UN, the head of the UN, and sort of brought forward these ideas of biodiversity in the buffer zone. And after that, the UNDP actually did a study of biodiversity, and it was found that there were mouflons, etc., which I think we'll hear more about afterwards. This study was done by scientists from the north and from the south, and also obviously birds, migratory birds, monk seals, which have been spotted not by scientists but actually by the military who was stationed in the enclave of Kokina. This is where the mouflons were seen in Barisea, and this idea of actually transforming these watchtowers, or this idea of not watching people but watching nature, and using the patrol path, this is in the city center, but as a sort of bicycle path across Cyprus. So, preserving this trail as the sort of necklace across the city. Now, this is another proposal in Nicosia based on a project in Beirut, which is this idea of a garden of forgiveness. And this was created by all the different communities in central Beirut, in an area where there was a lot of historical areas. And this is proposed also in Nicosia. So this is the project in Beirut on the Beirut Green Line. And also the idea, this was in Budapest, in Memento Park. So the idea is, what do we do with all the, the symbols or the nationalist often symbols or symbols of the power that we sort of, that have been taken down. So this is this was a very big statue of Macarius in the center of Nicosia. There was very, very big, we find often there's an amplification of scale as we get closer to the border. And this was after the fall of the wall, what happened to Lenin. So the idea in Budapest was to actually, collect all of this. We also see in the north a lot of representations of Kemal Atatürk, a lot of nationalist representations. These were just some provocations because Cyprus is a birthplace of Venus. So the idea was, either not just necessarily taking them down, but associating them also with maybe some more feminine or less nationalistic symbols. Another project we looked at with our students was looking at the Green Line as an opportunity to integrate the food, water, energy, and waste nexus. So looking at, an infrastructure where we could bring in all these new ways, ecological and green ways. I won't go into detail because this is a whole presentation, but there were different scenarios developed by the students for the Rocha recycling, also the concrete, etc. The restoration of riparian areas, a national park in the Green Line in Nicosia, and many different scenarios. So here we also talk in art and music as a bridge. As I'm a musician and also People for Earth also work with art and culture. I'm looking at different approaches. This was a bridge of peace that was proposed also by artists, different works by artists, art, reconciliation, and memory. This was actually different elements that were made by the soldiers. And this is a conceptual framework also looking at the DMZ. How do we intervene? Well, we have different things which are movements. So we have to look at the pathways, also the wildlife corridors, the driftways, the flyways, the riparian systems. And obviously the linear backbone, which is the patrol path. So this is really this linear system, the habitat corridors, for example. And then the nodes, which are the hotspots, whether they're for biodiversity, for culture, core areas, memorials, archaeological hotspots, and then punctual events. So this is a time, maybe commemoration, events, cultural, educational events. So as we said, the nodes, these are the hotspots, and this looks at the archaeology of the conflict. And I just found that there are joint excavations between North and South Korea by archaeologists in some of these cultural hotspots with the ancient cultures. And we've seen, as I mentioned, there's also been the excavations for the missing persons. There's all these different memorials and that have been made. And there's also these historical sacred sites. This is just a map of the sacred sites on both sides. And these are ones that are quite near to the border, these shrines which are historical, which are, before this division. So it's sort of common cultures to the north and the south, the Diamond Mountain in North Korea. And also these sort of traditional things linked with
죄송합니다. 안나 박사님 마무리 부탁드리겠습니다.
Would you please wrap it up? The time's up.
One of the things which is still common, is the Harvest Festival. So this is still celebrated in North and South Korea. This has just been celebrated recently. So we can see that some of these, they still have common festivals, and the Harvest Festival is very much linked to nature. So with the flows, there's also the cranes. So we have on the right, there's a crane dance by the shamans. On the left, these cranes are dancing. So this is a very important. I was very lucky to see this, the cranes dancing, but it's actually they come and the cranes stop over in the DMZ on their migratory paths, and these are symbols of peace and longevity. And there's a project with crane conservation, which is actually implemented in North Korea. Presently with the crane, the International Crane Foundation, and this is actually a video I was very, very fortunate to see in the DMZ with Professor Qui-gon Kim, who's done a lot of work on the wetlands in and along the DMZ. And we don't have time to watch it all, but the cranes actually do begin to dance together, that was really a blessing to see that. And it's sort of a symbol of North and South Korea sort of dancing together in the future. But these spaces, so we can see really the importance of preserving these landscapes and creating spaces for the migratory species. So these are very important as well. So it's really all the people, all the not just the resident populations of people and animals, but also the migratory. So now we're going to look at this idea of UNESCO, and people will talk about that later. So this is more spatial, but these are the UNESCO sites in North and South Korea. And also the work that's started to be done on the South Korea, because obviously this work has to be done on both sides. There needs to be, the sort of the proposal from both sides if it's still divided. Obviously, another discussion is what format, will the future peace be, whether it's a reunification, whether it's two, bizonal federation like in Cyprus, or still two states, but simply with a peaceful situation, not a conflict. So there's a study now to look at the different biosphere reserves, the core areas and transition and buffer zone areas, as I mentioned before, and also looking at the different land uses, the urban areas, the wetlands, etc. So this is an important work that is being done. Also, that Korea Forestry has been looking at the sort of sustainable development in these zones, and of course these are all projects that would also need to be developed in the northern part. There's also the idea of a marine peace park. I'm sorry, I don't have a very good representation. So this is also very important, is how the DMZ extends into the water. This is a very contested area, but it's also a great opportunity for creating a sort of marine peace park. There's a lot of very sensitive wetlands, sort of coastal wetlands. So now to finalize, I wanted to talk about some strategies and tools. So really, what is the pre-unification and post-unification strategies? So we mentioned before the eco-regions approach. And here we can see, that for example, this is the light and light pollution, that the north has much less light pollution. So it's also looking at the sort of benefits. This is looked at as a negative, but from a, conservation, nature and biodiversity, it's actually a benefit to have less light pollution for nature. So it's also a way to look at, a positive side of the less maybe developed part of the north. And these are mappings we did with some students when I was at the Harvard GSD. We created a workshop with the Korean students. So we were looking also at sort of the dust clouds coming from China, sort of the regional threats or the fires, all of these geo-ecological conditions. And obviously the pandemic yesterday, we had in the opening speeches, this opportunity for also, because pandemics and viruses cross borders, this is also another opportunity for more collaboration with North Korea. This is an idea that we also discussed with Professor Qui-gon Kim. That it's not just about having a master plan for the DMZ, but also having a grand master plan for the two Koreas, and looking at, what what benefits does North Korea have in maybe having less development, having, there's also maybe a lot more available land, for example. So looking at it not just from our usual economic way, but a future as sort of looking at a different way of evaluating, the development and future development. So here we just see the different provinces and sort of how they've been divided. So there's obviously the work of the border provinces already to work together. And here we mapped, for example, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which was a project, to a sort of cross-border project, industrial development. We also mapped the two capital cities, this bipolarity. And here, this was interesting to see, what are the common cultural things? Of course, we have two different, similar cultures, but they've developed in different ways, but there's still common languages and also common holidays, different economies. And here the wetlands, one of the students was interested in wetlands, so we were mapping all the wetlands along the DMZ and the importance of conserving them. So then there's the idea of the environmental master plan. Obviously the wetlands are important, as we saw the UNESCO biosphere.
Sorry, Dr. Anna.
Yes. And so anyway, these are the strategies for the future Korea DMZ, the sort of planning. So these are some ideas of how we can go forward. I'm not going to go into them in detail because I don't think I have much time, but there's different ideas. One is an international planning workshop to develop the instruments. And I will talk about this comprehensive master plan that I've mentioned. But one tool that I started to develop with the University of Vermont with Professor Salim Ali and Professor Azim Zia is this Atlas of Ecological Cooperation in Zones of Conflict, because I found this Zones of Conflict an Atlas of Future Wars. And the idea was to make an Atlas of Future Ecological Peace Zones. And we had a workshop with Professor Kim in Marseille. This was an art and science residency. So I work very much with this art and science because this is a way we collaborate across borders when it's not possible politically. Artists and scientists can often work across borders. And we had one of the scientists from North Cyprus who was doing the study of biodiversity. We had an artist from Cyprus. We had Professor Azim from University of Vermont and Professor Kwi-gon Kim. And we worked on developing this digital and dynamic atlas, which was featured on National Geographic. So very quickly, just looking at the idea of this digital atlas as a way to look at all the multiple layers of whether they go from political, from land use, from the diplomatic to the communities and even crowdsourcing. As we mentioned in Cyprus, it's the military that are sometimes observing nature, not necessarily the scientists or the citizens. In the green belt of Germany, it was really the ornithologists and the citizens, but not necessarily the scientists. And the idea is that you can have different levels of input, but also different levels of use depending on the type of information, if it's accessible or not to all the users. So this is an idea of a tool that we could, hope to develop to maybe even engage with academic scientists and artists in North Korea and also all around the world. So this idea of scale, you can work at different scales, different timelines, historical timelines, and obviously involving all the stakeholders. This was for Cyprus, but there are obviously the international NGOs all the way to the different support, economic, etc. This is from Michael Boutour, Frontiers. This is actually a citation that's on one of my CDs called Border Meetings. But the redouble, this makes me think of the two storks dance.
I'm so sorry, Doctor. I'm so sorry. Could you please wrap up the presentation? I'm so sorry for that.
This is my last slide, my last sentence. Yeah. So the redoubled frontier freed comes to life as a couple who dance, drawing their shadow and their flame on the walls of the planet Earth, conquering space in their embraces. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
I'm so sorry for not giving you enough time. Thank you very much for the presentation. And now I'd like to welcome the second speaker, Professor Klaus Wasselman. He is teaching at University of Auckland, New Zealand. He is a professor of environmental law and founding director of the New Zealand Center for Environmental Law. We had Professor Wasselman last year, but unfortunately, because of the current pandemic, we are meeting him on Zoom. Please welcome, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And a warm welcome to everybody I know and those who I do not yet know. I have very happy memories from last year, obviously. And as has been said, it wasn't meant to be this year in this rather tiresome Zoom meeting environment. Personally, I'm not very fond of these kind of arrangements, but we are all suffering from the same things. So on a positive note, I feel very much encouraged by the presentation of Anna Grichting, making the concept of cross-border governance and green belts and buffer zones really emerging to something far more ambitious, namely environmental zones or even peace parks. This really raises an issue from a legal perspective. How can we meet those challenges, not in a situation that we have in Germany? Luckily, after unification, everything became possible, but Korea obviously is in a very opposite situation, and thereby reflective of a fundamental dilemma that we are dealing with and that I want to talk about. And that is the dilemma of the oneness of nature and Earth being one, but the world being plenty, divided up in many states that are competing rather than cooperating. From a legal perspective, there are both, reflecting the theme of our session here, there are both challenges, obviously, to overcome those traditional boundaries between states, and opportunities. And our whole conference is about identifying opportunities. So what I'm going to do in my short time, next slide, please. Next. Thank you. As a brief overview, I will just briefly reflect on the gap between the concept of state sovereignty and environmental responsibilities. And secondly, present briefly the Earth trusteeship approach as an effort to overcome this gap and to ultimately remind us all that states are there for us and for our needs as human beings and for the needs of the environment and not the other way around. So the Earth trusteeship approach is, I think, a very promising concept that has emerged over the last few years, culminating so far in the adoption of the so-called Hague Principles, and then some final remarks on opportunities for the DMZ, as this has already been beautifully demonstrated with the comprehensive master plan that Anna Grichting talked about, that I'm very interested in. So next slide, please. So briefly, the concept of state sovereignty for non-lawyers among us has its origins in the famous Westphalian Treaty, providing a peace order in Europe after the 30-year-long war. And of course, the key concept of this idea that states should not interfere with each other and should respect each other fundamentally holds the notion that really with territorial sovereignty, which is really the essence of a sovereign state, comes a legal position that is very similar to the position that a private landowner has. So there's historically a interesting correlation between the concept of state sovereignty and property. Both, of course, are Western constructs. So property over the own territory has the association of exclusion of any other states or people. Next, please. This is expressed even in environmental treaties that followed in modern times in response to the global ecological crisis. Famously, Article 2 of the 92 Rio Declaration on Environment Development says that states have, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental and development policies. Next. And this, of course, is being understood by sovereign states, depending, of course, of political leaderships in those countries, but ultimately to treat their own territory as their own territory in legal terms, as almost as land property. Next. As a very dramatic effect of this kind of notion that's been so confirmed in international law, even in the context of the global environment, that the concept holds a certain exclusions of the other being other states, other people, namely non-citizens and foreigners, other beings like animals and plants, other areas, the global commons, meaning all areas outside national boundaries, and after all, Earth as a whole, and other times, future of humans, future of other species, with a whole set of areas and themes that are outside of any kind of legal concern for states. And it only takes, of course, political will to change this. The cooperation, therefore, is really hampered by the dominance of national interests, often defined as largely identical with economic interests and property rights in interests that are competing. So this is the tradition, and we could elaborate, of course, how this concept of state sovereignty is beginning to change, but arguably there's a long way to go before we understand a sovereign state also as a legal recognition of responsibilities. But there are, of course, developments towards the direction that create certain responsibilities of states towards others and towards the environment. After all, we talk about human rights, we talk about international environmental treaties, and so on. Next. Here we are. Next, please. Following this very article to the next sentence, then talks about the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Next, goes even further. Article 7 famously says, state shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth ecosystem. So there you have it. A non-lawyer would say, well, what's the problem? There are duties and it's only a matter of enforcement. The lawyer, the international law community, however, has been observing time and again that these kind of acknowledgements in so-called soft law documents have never resulted in tangible or even enforceable duties of states to provide mechanisms that are actually capable to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem, regardless of the fact that this notion, this obligation, has been expressed in no less than 27 international agreements. This is a very impressive number, including even the Paris Climate Agreement or the current draft for a global pact for the environment, a initiative of the French government that's currently before the United Nations. So there is language there, and it takes really a little bit more than just writing something into a text and to fully appreciate the implications, what it really means for obligations of states. And the argument here is that these obligations exist nationally in many constitutions, but can also be expressed in international legal terms. Next. This is where Earth jurisprudence comes in. Traditional international law stops here, but then environmental lawyers and ecological lawyers are, of course, keen to investigate possibilities to bridge the reality of an ecological one, planet Earth, and the diversity of legal systems and political systems, cultural systems of the world on the other hand. So Earth jurisprudence, Earth law, Earth system law, Earth governance, Earth system governance, ecological law and governance, these are not just catchwords, they are representing a lot of scholarship and networks, and I won't go into this now and today, but really to appreciate that over the last few years we have really growing global networks that take Earth at the center of thinking about law and governance. Next. In an address to the General Assembly, I was 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, I was able to share some ideas with representatives there, delegates there, to make these 3 points. Observation number 1, stewardship and guardianship for nature and earth is a foundational ethical concept in all religions and cultures. There's a universal understanding that we all as human beings have those kind of guardianship or stewardship duties towards nature and the earth. However, nation states have yet to incorporate these ethical concepts in law and governance. Earth trusteeship, therefore, would provide an opportunity to actually implement the duty of states to protect the integrity of Earth's ecological systems, as expressed in some 25 international agreements, as mentioned. Next. As a consequence of these scholarship in recent years, the Earth Initiative, Earth Trusteeship Initiative, was established in 2017-18, a collaboration of many networks, only a few are mentioned here, culminating in the adoption of what's called the Hague Principles for a Universal Declaration on Responsibilities for Human Rights and Earth Trusteeship, adopted on the 18th of December. Sorry, it was the 10th of December. This was it's important to know, the 10th of December 2018. It happens to be the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we, as a coalition of many human rights groups and environmental organizations, saw it appropriate that 70 years later, we should adopt or take a first step towards thinking about human rights in the context of responsibilities and in institutional terms expressed as a trusteeship for each other and for the earth as a whole. This was then complemented earlier this year by a declaration on education for Earth trusteeship. This declaration was created by the laureates of the Alternative Nobel Prize. They came together in Bangkok and created this rather helpful document in the spirit of fundamental human values like peace and human rights that these laureates are so beautifully representing and have been acting for. So the aims of the Earth Trusteeship Initiative is manifold, and you can see it for yourself. I just want to highlight the upcoming Stockholm +50 conference in June 2022 to celebrate 50 years since the first Earth Summit in Stockholm 1972, when the global environmental crisis was recognized by states. 50 years later, of course, our situation has become far worse, and nevertheless, we have not seen any major breakthroughs in terms of a fundamental commitment of states to protect the environment and the earth as a whole. There will be an important conference, preparatory conference in June, if things go well, in Stockholm in June next year, where civil society should be formulating their positions, and the Earth trusteeship, along with the Earth system approach that I'm sure Rakyung Kim will say more about, and Earth system governance, will bring their input to the bear in the hope that the outcome documents of Stockholm +50, the Earth Summit, will really have language and the formulation of a Earth trusteeship concept. Next, please. The Hague Principles here, I won't go into any detail and will be very brief and will be wrapping up in a few minutes. The idea was, next, if you show in highlight in red, next please. Yeah, that's it. I want you just to realize 2.1, the new conceptualization as we perceive it is to see human rights, these very important entitlements of all human beings, however, being grounded in our membership as human beings within the community of life, the Earth community, which qualifies what rights we are called on to honor and what responsibilities we have for each other and for nature. So it's very important to make this nexus, that any kind of human rights, they operate in a context, not just in a social context of human beings, but equally in an ecological context. We are part of nature, and therefore nature, of course, does not need rights per se, but we have fundamental responsibilities towards nature based on our belonging to the community of life. Next, please. Another key aspect in Principle 1.2, each state individually and the international community of states collectively acknowledge that they have and share responsibilities for nature in cooperation and in alliance with their citizens as equal trustees of Earth and the integrity of Earth ecological systems. So the idea of states having tangible and legally relevant trusteeship responsibility is subject to, as I mentioned, a number of writings and conferences. Just here in Auckland, we had a conference last weekend on this phenomenon we have here in New Zealand. We are the first country that recognizes rights of nature in the context of the famous Whanganui River and also the National Uruvira Park. The recognition that, that nature has an intrinsic value and requiring trusteeship responsibilities of the government. So the conference that we had was very encouraging, not necessarily with respect to current legal reforms here in New Zealand, but this is what we are dealing with. Each country affected, of course, has their own responsibilities, or more precisely, civil societies in our various countries are, of course, encouraged and in need to promote such guardianship and trusteeship responsibilities. Next, in the context of Korea, we talked about already today. Yes, come next, please. No, not back. Yeah, that's it. The question, of course, whether a concept of cross-border trusteeship for the Korean demilitarized zone is a possibility. And Anna very helpfully referred to the many efforts already behind the creation of a biosphere reserve, for example. It was a bit of an ill start about 10 years ago or 8 years ago when the South Korean government took the initiative, and this was greeted with hostility and non-interest on the part of North Korea. But not the least, the last conference we had in September last year offered some opportunities to make some progress. As I took it, the message from our previous conference was very clearly, we need to cooperate with UNESCO in some form or another, not to win over UNESCO per se and let UNESCO do the job for us, but rather bringing UNESCO into a position where they would accept or support or otherwise tolerate an initiative coming from civil society, from independent experts, from people who do not have stakes one way or the other in support of North Korea or South Korea, but would be purely interested in converting the DMZ to a co-border environmental or nature trusteeship zone along the lines of what I was trying to illustrate here.
죄송합니다. 박세령 교수님 마치어 주시면 좋겠습니다.
Would you please wrap up? The time is up.
For then a process that Anna talked about. I'm very keen to learn more about the comprehensive master plan and find a forum where these ideas could be followed further. So next, final, please. Yeah, you can go through it. And next and final, and then I'm done. And I thank you very much. Next, please. So that's it. Thank you.
네, 역시
Thank you very much. That I wish I could give Professor more time, and I once again I'm sorry for that. And now I'd like to welcome the third speaker. That we have Professor Kim Lak-hyun. He has good knowledge about international system on environmental issues, and as the time is delayed, that I'd like to welcome him immediately.
Thank you, Professor, for your kind introduction. I'm very delighted to take part in this conference. So from a park to a legal person, as you can see from the title of the talk, I will be speaking about existing proposals to establish a peace park in or around the DMZ, and also pick up some of the ideas that Professor Hosselman and Dr. Griching shared with us. So in recent years, green détente has emerged as a promising concept for building sustainable peace in conflict zones. The idea is basically that environmental diplomacy could stimulate scientists and others who are not directly involved in politics from the opposite sides to work together for nature conservation and build trust that may spill over into the political arena. So pointing to successful cases found in some parts of the world, for example, Ecuador and Peru, advocates of this idea argue that the concept could be applied to ease tension between the two Koreas. So in my brief presentation, I'd like to give you an overview of how this concept of green détente has been applied in the Korean context, and also what remain as possible alternatives or options to explore further. And in doing so, I'll put the options into two broad categories: the existing proposals under the what I called multilateral peace-centric category, and introduce bilateral and nature-centric as possibly a complementary or even alternative category. I'd like to highlight upfront, it's not my aim to argue one is better than the other, but just to make a modest contribution to the ongoing debate on the future of the DMZ. So for more than 25 years, South Korea has proposed on a number of occasions to work together with North Korea for nature conservation in the DMZ. The proposals have evolved slightly over the years, but all revolve around the idea of designating a part of the DMZ as some form of a co-managed peace park. So as a nature park, its primary objective will be nature conservation, but this objective is often seen as a means to achieving the end of peace building. And unfortunately, for various reasons, none of the previous attempts have so far came to fruition. What I'd like to highlight here, what needs to be pointed out is that most, if not all, such proposals for a peace park were envisioned to take place in a multilateral forum rather than through bilateral talks. Of course, establishing a park through a multilateral forum has certain benefits, of course, such as the procedure in place for site designation and management, as well as the possibility to involve third parties as mediators in what are likely to be very difficult negotiations. And possibly for these reasons, multilateralism seems to have been favored by South Korea. But there are, of course, downsides of such an approach, which I will get to later in my talk. But so far, there are several multilateral forums exist for establishing a peace park. But so far, it seems that the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, is the only forum that has been seriously considered. UNESCO offers 3 types of protected areas: World Heritage sites, biosphere reserves, and relatively new global geoparks. Which one of the 3 is most fitting for the DMZ is another question that would require a separate analysis, but so far the World Heritage option has been most discussed. And there are several approaches for setting up a transboundary park, but what has been considered as perhaps most pragmatic is to set up 2 separate protected areas on both sides of the DMZ first, and then the two areas could then be gradually expanded right up to the military demarcation line, and subsequently transformed into one unified transboundary area. For now, one of the most promising locations is the easternmost part of the DMZ, where there is a mountain range that has a special place in the Korean psyche. North Korea has recently designated Mount Kumgang as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 2018, and Mount Sorak on the South Korean side has long been a Biosphere Reserve since 1982. And the two are only several tens of kilometers apart. And indeed, the possibility to join these two areas has in fact been identified as a priority project in 2018 by the South Korean Ministry of the Environment, although clear progress is yet to be observed. An alternative forum to UNESCO, which I would say deserves some serious attention or consideration, is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. It's an international environmental treaty established in 1971 for the purpose of conserving wetlands for, especially as waterfowl habitat. And parties to this convention designate certain wetlands as wetlands of international importance, also known as Ramsar sites, and they are supposed to closely monitor for any changes in their ecological character and restore the wetlands where necessary. A key advantage of the Ramsar Convention over UNESCO is that this convention is relatively fresh on North Korea's minds, I would say, as North Korea has recently joined the convention in 2018, after many years of preparation. And also, compared to UNESCO, the process of designating a Ramsar site is relatively simple and perhaps politically less burdensome as well. And there is already some NGO cooperation or collaboration between North and South Koreas in this area of wetlands conservation. And there are several candidate wetlands that can be identified within the DMZ as a possible transboundary Ramsar site, including the estuary of the Han River, which I show on the slide. So, so far, I have discussed options for establishing a peace park in the DMZ in a multilateral setting. Like I said, there are certain benefits, advantages to such an approach, as I discussed. But fundamentally, one could question whether the Koreas, I'm cautiously suggesting and here, but one could question whether the Koreas are indeed in need of yet another multilateral approach to peace building, or if the Koreas could be a bit more ambitious here when it comes to environmental diplomacy and aim for more direct and bilateral engagement that is very much needed for building trust between the two Koreas. Another question to think about is if the lessons from successful peace park examples from other parts of the world are really transferable to the DMZ. And I like to point out that unlike those examples, the two Koreas are not in a territorial dispute. So the political dynamics are very different here in this case. And for these reasons and possibly many more, I would argue that it is time to explore other pathways that might be more suitable for bringing sustainable peace to the DMZ. And here I suggest that putting nature at the center of concerns rather than its value to humanity or even peace building as such could be a different paradigm worthy of serious consideration. And this is to say, not taking the environment as only a means to achieving peace, but an end in and of itself. For example, we could consider the idea of rights of nature, which New Zealand has recently operationalized and put to use, which Professor Bosselman introduced earlier. And I will not go into the details of the New Zealand case, but granting legal personhood to nature is essentially about freeing nature from its current legal status as mere property to humans and recognizing the intrinsic values not only just instrumental values, including peace building. So granting certain legal rights to nature is one way of showing respect for nature, I would say. And I'm not suggesting such an eco-centric approach to peace will be easy. It is no doubt ambitious idea, and there are many difficult questions to address. Some of the immediate questions that would pop up include questions like, who represent the interests of the DMZ and under which law? And I'd like to share some very preliminary ideas I have on these questions. So rights, in my view, will have to be derived from a set of principles that are shared by both North and South Koreas. This implies that the two Koreas agreeing on certain principles in the form of an international agreement. This would be a very significant exercise, in my view, also for finding a common ground in the understanding of basic legal rights under the two different systems. And in terms of representation, a commission could be set up to represent the DMZ as a rights holder, and it could consist of both governmental and non-governmental stakeholders from various sectors. The commission could also be able to represent the DMZ in an independent international tribunal should either a government or a private individual infringes on the rights of the DMZ. So what would be a possible candidate? In my view, the history of the Han River makes an excellent candidate for the idea of granting rights to nature. This river history has a very special status under the 1953 Korean Armistice Agreement, where technically there is no military demarcation line running through this area. It is a shared area, which makes it a perfect candidate. Some South Korean politicians are already, in fact, discussing ways to transform this history into what they call a peace sea. But rather than establishing a symbolic park here, granting rights to the river history could be considered as an option. So, just to share some of my final thoughts. While the concept of green detente is promising, its application has been generally limited in the DMZ context to creating a transboundary peace park in a multilateral setting, especially through UNESCO. But considering the limited success the Koreas have had so far by following this existing approach, it's probably time to explore some other forums, such as the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. More importantly, I put forward a case for putting nature at the center of concerns in building sustainable peace. I briefly explored the wild idea of granting legal personhood to the Han River history. But such a nature-centric approach through bilateral engagement would effectively turn our focus from establishing a park or treating the DMZ as an object for protection to a legal person, a subject with rights. And this nature-centric approach, in effect, would introduce a third party in need of care from both North and South Koreas, and may change the dynamics considerably. And the river history might be able to serve as an effective intermediary between the two Koreas, and somewhat comparable to a child of divorced parents. Thank you very much. That was the end of my talk.
네, 감사합니다. 시간을 잘 지켜주셨고요.
Thank you very much. And in particular, thank you to be punctual. And as I mentioned earlier, it's live broadcasted at the YouTube. And if you have any question or comment, please leave it on the chat box. Let me just introduce you the third presenter. And Professor Kostas Konstantino will be the third presenter. And he is a professor at Kypros University. He is expert in the international relations. The floor is yours. Please begin.
Yes, I'm trying to share. Can you see my my presentation. Hey, good morning, good afternoon to those of you who are in Korea and everywhere around the world. My presentation basically concerns two questions. How practices of diplomacy promotes the harmony with nature initiative on a global scale, and what alternative forms of diplomacy does harmony with nature promote in return? And I'm responding to these questions by exploring conceptual frames that are, I think, useful for understanding this negotiation of nature, which involves both a negotiation of the meaning of nature, but also the materiality of nature. And I was very interested in hearing what Klaus Bosselman was saying about soft law, and there are lots of agreements. What exactly does it mean to apply specific concepts or specific provisions of declarations or even treaties, soft law, hard law? I think this is the crux of the issue, and why I want to focus on this idea of biodiplomacy. And I also want to apply some of my preliminary findings on a specific site, the United Nations buffer zone, whereas the harmony with nature is a kind of a new interest that have been developing the last couple of years. The UN buffer zone in Cyprus is something that I have been studying for 10, 15 years, so I know a bit more about that. But I'm testing a lot of things, and I'm actually learning a lot from colleagues who have already spoken in this panel. First, let me start for some reason. Okay. There is a tension, if we kind of look at some of the preliminaries, the tension between the concept of sustainable development and the idea of harmony with nature. On the one hand, there is this idea that harmony with nature, which is a non-anthropocentric paradigm through which to re-engage nature, is supporting in many respects sustainable development, including the SDGs of the United Nations. And some, of course, also see sustainable development as a concept that is something that has reached its limits, that it has limitations with regard to how far we can reverse the impact of the Anthropocene. And partly this has to do also with conflicting understandings over what is what do we mean by sustainable development? How do we negotiate that in practice? What do we understand by sustainability? Sustainability with regard to what and how far? Are we looking at material resources or ecosystems or specific species, communities, cultures? Bioculture that Anna Krichting was referring to earlier. How far do we bring this into the equation? Also, the idea of development, whether we give emphasis on sustainable development or sustainable development. And when we say development, is it about economic growth? Is it about capacity building? Is it about fair resource distribution? And so on. So how we negotiate the meaning and how we apply the meaning of sustainable development to specific cases, I think is the crux of the issue. And I think with regard to harmony with nature, what is very interesting, part of what some of my colleagues were saying earlier, is also the idea of this potentially more radical, transformational approach to diplomacy that is more attentive to the human, non-human encounter. This is what harmony with nature can bring into current debates. But even though we are interested in diplomacy, or I'm interested in diplomacy, the question again is what diplomacy is bringing to harmony with nature, or which diplomacy are we talking about here? Is it state diplomacy? Again, some of the issues that Klaus Bosselmann was mentioning before. How committed are states? How far are they developing this indigenous knowledge and traditional practice of living, out of which the concept of harmony with nature has developed? How is this being developed into an international norm, which is shaped by intergovernmental state interests? Of course, it is also taking into account the views of academics, the views of indigenous peoples, etc. But I think it is also very important to figure out, to think about the direction that harmony with nature will be taking in the future, and how far diplomacy, intergovernmental diplomacy, is shaping it, is streamlining it, and is instrumentalizing it. Maybe in ways that are positive, but I think we need to look at also risks or, if you like, limitations in how states are now conceptualizing harmony with nature. And this brings me to the idea of needing to understand how harmony with nature can and ought to transform diplomacy. To a considerable extent, diplomacy has been changing over the last few decades. We are moving away from simply state-centric diplomacy that is concerned with the promotion of national interests. We are looking at human-centric diplomacy that, of course, promotes human rights, human welfare across national borders. But nowadays, with the concern with protecting biodiversity, I think we are also talking about, or we are moving to people already discussing more than human diplomacy, a more holistic understanding of diplomacy where we recognize subjects beyond states, beyond non-state actors, but also beyond the human interests and human communities. We look at more than human communities that, of course, we need to understand their mode of being. We need to translate and explain this in decision-making processes like the UN and UN fora, and of course find ways to address their specific needs. And harmony with nature also brings, as I said earlier, this idea of more transformational modes of diplomacy, realizing that diplomacy, generally diplomacy has this negative image that it's, how do I get my way? How do I use strategy to achieve my policy goals? But diplomacy can also be transformational. Through my encounter with others, I can understand who I am. I can and get an idea of a greater self, understand the continuum of life across species. This is something actually that even traditional diplomacy, getting in touch with the other, with the enemy, you are also getting to understand different interests and different viewpoints that he or she has. And this has the ability to transform the self. And I think this is very important for seeing diplomacy and harmony with nature and exploring the harmony with nature initiative with contemporary diplomatic initiatives. I employ the term biodiplomacy. I used it in a recent article that I wrote with a colleague, Samo Pondo, on biodiplomacy, published in the Journal of International Political Theory. And we define biodiplomacy as a continuous negotiation of the meaning and materiality of particular ways of living vis-a-vis other ways of being. And by that, of course, we are not suggesting that other conceptual frames like biopolitics or biocracy do not have interesting insights to offer in this debate about harmony with nature and ecological approaches to global governance. Already terms like biopolitics, which have been used to suggest the enhancement of human life, the idea of optimizing the self through governmental techniques, how Foucault used it. There are people like Lemke, Braverman that are already using biopolitics in more than human terminologies. They are referring to more than human biopolitics. Also biocracy, and we are going to hear more about that in a while. I understand that it's already moving from this original idea of how we can influence life forces or human behavior to what Mari is interested in terms of participatory universe and about the need to give recognition and legal status to other than human life forms. Also, biodiplomacy has already been used in terms of the Convention of Biological Diversity and the implementation of that convention. I'm also interested in how it can help us actually to think more intensely about the negotiation aspects of negotiating nature, or negotiating diversity, enhancing biodiversity. It's not simply a question of applying more ethical approaches or more useful normative kind of commitments, having a deep normative commitment and applying it. I think the idea of bringing diplomacy into the equation is actually in order to appreciate how far questions like harmony always need to be, we need to understand how this is being applied in practice. How far does it involve a balancing of forces that may not necessarily be a means through which we can always have an acceptable outcome that will be beneficial to all forms of life. And I think a good example of this is are invasive species and how do we deal with invasive species. And disagreements even within the environmental community, ecologists who are more in support of ecosystem conservation versus animal rights activists. Do we cull or do we not cull gray squirrels in Britain or not? These are not easy questions, and it's not simply a question of finding of having a normative commitment and actually implementing it through good local governance or good global governance. It always requires a reflexive negotiation of different modes of existence. Let me because I'm aware of time, I don't want to take more time with the more conceptual issues. Let me very briefly give you an example from the Cyprus case study, which actually shows that when you are trying to negotiate ecology in places like the buffer zone, in ways that Anna Grichting was referring to before, we need to realize that we may have some spaces within the buffer zone which are, from an ecological perspective, very precious, very worthy, very important to protect. However, there are also issues that may affect specific communities. And I'm not just referring to, let's say, in the case of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot community, north and south, and how they have different, may have different needs about how to implement specific policies within the buffer zone. I'm talking about also communities that have been displaced. We may have serendipitous conservation in the buffer zone. We see the unintended consequences of the conflict actually being beneficial to the endangered mouflon in Cyprus, which is an animal which was close to extinction, and it was only because of policies that the government has followed, but also because of the buffer zone, that the mouflon conservation policy has been so successful. I've done some interviews with the people in the forestry department, and what is very interesting is that whereas the conservation area of the mouflon goes beyond the buffer zone, maybe 70–80% of the mouflons are in the buffer zone. So one can see how important is the buffer zone with regard to protecting these endangered species. So definitely there is every reason to find ways of actually maintaining conservation and ecological protection, given that the humans left, the non-humans have returned. However, the refugees also have rights, and when you have conflicts which have not been comprehensively settled, there is a negotiation of how to settle the Cyprus conflict currently. A number of refugees, even though there are also, these are photographs that I show you here from actually Varisha, one of the villages that Anna Grichting mentioned earlier. This is the area where it's fully reclaimed by nature, because other parts of the buffer zone, there are civilian uses, there are agricultural or pastoral uses of the buffer zone elsewhere in Cyprus, but in this area, in Varisha, it is totally reclaimed by nature. However, there are also refugees, and here I have some, I went there with the refugee community, 3 people actually from the village of Varisha, who, even though are very appreciative of the fact that you see mouflons.
죄송합니다. 코스타스 교수님 마무리.
Would you please wrap up? Time is up.
Even though they are very appreciative of this new condition of the buffer zone, at the same time, they also feel the pain and the need to return back to their village, and this creates a kind of disharmony. especially when you consider that just a few kilometers down the roads, there is a lot of development outside the buffer zone. So people are feeling that the buffer zone is also being used for greenwashing purposes. It's different to discuss the rights of nature in, let's say, places like New Zealand, where indigenous peoples are very committed and have a spiritual attachment to land, and try to develop this idea in relation to places where there is a lot of real estate development. They don't have that spiritual connection. This connection, this harmony with nature may be developed. However, one issue is how far this would be conducive to peace building or not, if you don't bring in the local community to actually take possession and support an initiative. So in conclusion, I think buffer zones offer fantastic opportunities to experience nature anew, but the local communities need to be brought into the equation. I also think that promoting harmony with nature, doing environmental justice needs to come to terms with shifting ethical perspectives, which one may apply to specific sites. And finally, biodiplomacy, I think the idea of why I would like to concentrate on diplomacy is precisely to show that we need to endorse pluriversality and deep commitment to the reflexive negotiation of rival modes of existence of human and non-human communities. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now we have two speakers remaining. We have two gentlemen joining me right here. So as they are close to me, I'd like to ask you for a favor. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to give you 10 minutes for each presentation. So now I'd like to welcome Mr. Kim Jun-soo, researcher of Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology.
Today I'm going to talking about the variegated tones in the modern human world. I was quite surprising that because we are all sharing the similar concepts and similar ideas about the DMGs and relation between the human and non-humans. So today I'm briefly introduce the some perceptional tones or ontological tones in this era about the Anthropocene, because I'm working in the Anthropocene Center for now, and I also wanted to imply the working in the modern human geographies, how these theories are involving our perception to understanding the space, especially about the DMG. We are living, as far as we know, they're living in the era of the tones. More than about the 30 years, we're starting with talking about the cultural tones or spatial tones, or even recently we are talking about the post-structuralism. Today I want to talking about the materialistic tones, which we need to interesting in about the non-human agencies and more than human concepts. So this kind of a concept is making us to think about the social nature, new concept about the relation between social and nature, or techno nature or urban nature, because we briefly thinking about the nature is far away from our existence, but I'm not saying that way. Nature itself is very close to us and maintaining our life itself and influence to our whole everyday life. The kind of things that bring us to thinking about the new concept about the social and nature. So it is hard to say that the concept of the Anthropocene is not officially confirmed yet in the international geological community, but that kinds of terms are pervadely using in the public and the academia. So this kind of terms bring us to the ontological terms. Are we going to accept the human exceptionalism, or are we going to accept the other species or other non-human actors living with us? So this kind of ontological questions bring us to the new materialism about the more than human world and multi-ontological existence. So these kinds of terms are making us to thinking about bring the new concept or a new method to understand how the world is working. So I'm working in the field of the political geographies and political ecologists in the area. Nowadays, we are using the terms planetary urbanization. The city is not the physical entity itself, but connected to planetary. So this kind of concept is thinking about the changing how we understand the space itself. Previously, we understand the space as the very unmoving or unchangeable things. But as you can see, the variety of the mapping described in this presentation. In the right side of the pictures, it seems like some kind of cells or some kind of atoms, but it is the mapping of the artificial craft near the Earth's orbit. And then the left side, downside the map is about the coal mining connections in the Northeast Asia area. So these kinds of new mappings and these kinds of new perception bring us to thinking about changing our understanding about certain spaces. We needed a new map, drawing a new maps and the kinds of things that bring us to thinking about different spaces at the same time. So I'm working in the more than human geographies. They are mapping the non-human actors near our life. So you can see the left side of the map is mapping of the mosquitoes, and the right side is the map of the rats in the New York City. So these kinds of mapping skills and mapping, drawing the new perception of the space is thinking about how we are living in it and who we are living with it together in our life. So also, I want to make a stress that how we gonna perceive that these new mapping skills as a method, and then how the knowledge itself is constructed. This map is pretty similar, same places in the Arizona in the United States. They're drawing a map of the mosquito, where the yellow spot is pointed in is where the mosquito is existing. But the left side one seems like a very democratic distribution of the mosquito. But right side is very centric area is existing in the map because of the red rocks. That distance between two maps is about the resolution, the scale resolution. The left side is about the 1 meter resolution, and right one is a 30 meters resolution. So we can say this is the scientific fact, or it is the quite objective knowledge. But at the same time, where we are seeing is making very different knowledge in it. Where the mosquito is living, are there democratically distributed living, or is there any centralized area? These kinds of things that bring the political responsibility to who gonna charge these issues. If we choose the right side of the map, the red spot is about the state learning facilities like waterways and other facilities funding from the government. So this responsibility to the risk of the West Nile mosquito is about charging their responsibility to the state. Or if we choose the left side of the map, technology, it will be charging for everyone living in the cities. So it is quite a different notion that how we're gonna establish the knowledge itself, and politics of the knowledge is a very emerging area and very important question about our Anthropocene area. So I was also want to emphasize how the state and nature relationship is changing and shaping each other. So previously, we're thinking the state is the one device that consume the nature or framing the nature as the kind of a natural resource or some tools to making their entities. But if we see the very different ontological point of view, the state and the nature relation is pushing each other to and shaping each other, because the concept of the power of the hyphen between these two subjects, state and the nature, is emerging each other. They are not gonna existing if they're not existing each others. So they are interdependent and interopen concept of the state-nature relationships. So to understand the state-nature relationship in the South Korea context, also the East Asia context, we need to understand how state was working toward the nature, and nature itself also working toward the state. In South Korea and most of East Asia, Northeast Asia countries are experiencing the developmental state or developmental urbanization process. Not only that, but also the Cold War landscape is very important concept to understanding how our society is working. So I want to emphasize the DMG is not just single entities or a single nature or some established concept of it, but as we we appreciate that DMG as some sort of a methodology. It is very useful to understand how the East Asia countries, not only the South Korea, were emerging each other in the context of state-nature relationships, and also the understanding the ontological terms in about the context of Anthropocene. So as Anna shared the same pictures, but we are previously thinking the DMG as the static physical spaces or some sort of a pure nature or untouched nature, or sometimes a restricted area of human activity. But we need to figure out what kinds of non-human actors are evolving and dynamically moving inside and outside of these spaces. So figure out the multi-dimensional actors inside the DMG and figure out human and non-human relationship inside in it. I want to emphasize these terms, social nature and social material relations. So I bring some very simple examples from DMGs, how they're recently emerging non-human actors inside DMG. First one, some of you will figure out what it is, but it's randomized. Evaluating more than 2 million randomized deployed inside the DMG, but we don't know where they are exactly located and where they are figured out. So this is the kind of existing riskscape in the DMG, and this sort of material, risk material, is emerging problem. Whenever the heavy rain or the storms come or flood is happen, the DMG area, the randomized flow to the local neighborhoods and making some serious problems. So these kinds of material is existing. We are not seeing also it is moving through the DMG. So we are not gonna seeing the DMG is some sort of a pure nature or some sort of untouched area, but very riskily existing, and this has their own ontological position through the social historical context in South Korea. Not only that, some sort of danger or some sort of riskscape is existing. This map scatter is about the African swine fever virus is emerged. It's starting last year, 2012, the African swine fever was making a serious problem inside the DMZ. Currently, this confirmed case of 500 dead wild boar is moving through that virus. So last week, there was some positive and dynamic news from the Ministry of Environment that saying that you can see the red spot area. There are found the antibody of the African swine fever virus is first emerged, because that kind of virus has a very unique materiality, not just during the wild boar, but they are existing in the soil and existing through the water. And not only that, mortality is almost reached 100% to the swine families. So there you can see the right side of the picture is a checkpoint. It is not a checkpoint for military purpose, but seems like quite a military purpose. It is a checkpoint for the African swine fever sanitation facilities in the Cheorwon area. So we are living, and the DMZ is existing with a very dynamic material flow, and the social nature is existing inside the DMZ. As Anna also pointed out that the crane bird is living through the DMZs. This has a very different species, but also most of them are endangered species inside in it. So they are moving through the international boundaries, as Professor Bosema says about the state sovereignties, but non-human actors, not just staying in the one human nation state, but moving through the multi-area, and then sometimes it's very flow with the international boundaries. So DMG is working through as the dynamic space of the human and non-human actors. It is not just the static physical entities, but also moving through the human and non-human relationships. So to understand the DMG as a methodology, I want to emphasize the four different practice about and thinking about our perception to understand the DMG. I want to emphasize the practice. We previously focused on discussions, and we through thinking through the discussions and how human beings are thinking through some sort of non-human actors, but I think the practice is one of our basic terms for relocating the social agency in practice. And also we are focusing on meanings of some things, but I think it is time to changing our thinking about the affection is one of the very important concept to understand something, because affection is quite a different using term of the emotion. Emotion is very formed or classified some feelings, but affection is a sudden, and affection means something I feel directly to my sense. So affecting with the non-human actors through the encountering with a very different contact zone, like Anna and said it is buffer zone, but we're saying the contact zone. So we contact with very different non-human actors near our everyday life. So these kinds of non-human actors bring us some sort of a direct feeling to us and making a perception and even evolving to the emotion to something. So I want to emphasize the more than human mode of inquiries is emerging importance in the DMG, because it is not just about the animals or plants. As we can saw the landmine case, it is also technological devices that have their own agencies to moving through the DMGs. Also, as I saw in the previous work about the planetary urbanization, the politics of knowledge is very important in notion instead of a politics of identity, because the politics of knowledge is how they are working through the construct our life through the science or scientific knowledges, or what we're thinking about the scientific fact is socially constructed, and also how we're gonna see is changing the knowledge itself too. So I was making a show that about the DMG as the methodology is very strategic toward the thinking about the harmony with the nature, to thinking about what nature is and what state was. So to figure out that also it is not quite a new emerging idea, but it is previously existing, but we forgotten often. The civic society is working through the living together with the non-human actors inside the DMG. They are spread the feed for the crime birds, and state area also trying to thinking about the how and what kinds of non-human species or non-human actors are existing inside the DMG. They're figuring out what kind of plant in it and what kind of biodiversity is working through it. So it is quite important, but we also thinking about what knowledge is produced through this concept. So I will briefly concluding mark that DMG is not some sort of a static area, but dynamically moving, not only about the social historical context of South Korea, but ontologically also the epistemically context. So we needed to increase our literacy to reading its ecological and environmental context. I think it could be some sort of a scientific knowledge, also some sort of feelings, some sort of affection is the basic tool for understanding its literacy toward the ecological context. So I want to emphasize that understanding the multi-ontology inside the DMG is a priority of understanding the harmony with the nature in the DMG. So I also want to emphasize that development and environmental peace is not just about a segregated and separated concept, but they are interconnected. So this kind of concept is also have a power of the hyphen their concept because they are making each other toward it. So I want to emphasize ending emphasis to the thinking about what is the nature with the harmony with not just the human beings, but also with non-human actors inside our everyday life, especially in the DMZ. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you. So finally, we are having the final presentation, and the senior researcher Im Cheorwon will make the presentation. Please start. Hello everyone, I am Cheorwon Lim, just as introduced. I'd like to talk about three things. First is biocracy, and the second is the community, and the third is that I am representing the Korea Policy Association, and every two others we host the international conference. What I want to talk about is biocracy issues. And this gathering is hosted by UN agencies and UN researchers. So I need to introduce biocracy as a one agenda of UN and how to implement that. And if we have an approach of epistemic community, that might be a little better because the concept of biocracy is pretty new and unfamiliar. So I want to suggest that we can make an epistemic community approach. In the introduction, so far, the biocracy was far away from our daily lives. From macroeconomic perspective, I'd like to touch upon biocracy. Many other speakers largely focus on some specific cases or some the borderlands, but I want to look back. I want to look into the biocracy concept from the historical perspective. So the first thing is that we are facing the climate change and COVID-19. Because of that, we are facing unprecedented situation. And the norm, we are reflecting and introspecting on modern science and technology-based civilization. Actually, we are supposed to meet in Cheorwon City, but we are having the online meeting because of the COVID-19 situation. It's not one-time event. There might be some this kind of changes in the future going on. So from the perspective, our lifestyle and our thought will be changes for a long time. Then the democracy and the new alternative democracy will be required. On the retrospect, a huge changes is happening at the global stage. In case of COVID-19, this infectious disease hit hardest the whole global community. It lasts about a year, and no one knows when it will disappear from the earth. And post-COVID-19, we also may expose to risk of another infectious disease or some climate crisis. Then the ecosystems might go through very dramatic changes. Then we are moving towards a new civilizations. So I believe we are at the starting point to make the shift. So the democracy, which is one of the modern concepts, should be shifted to biocracy in the future. That's my suggestion. So the agenda of biocracy need to be officially escalated and introduced. Then the biocracy should be understood as an alternative of our existing democracy. The biocracy should not be limited to the politics, but it should be understood from the scientific, social, and the political science perspective. we are at the era of making shift of civilizations. If that's the case, then the science and technology-based civilization is just started to begin and make a shift. So far, our civilization is strongly rooted on rationality, science, and industrialization. And we have spent 500 years under this notion. And also, representative democracy has become a very big and kind of, the backbone of our civilizations. However, this civilization is now shifting to new ecological civilization. At the same time, we are moving into the new era of Anthropocene. That means human beings were negatively or some very not actively respond to the nature, but we are now making our attitude to make an active and proactive response to and with the nature. And we can understand the situation under the COVID-19 pandemic. And from this year on, as we are experiencing that pandemic situation, we are in the transitional era into a new civilization. For a couple of years, the people for Earth has argued. So the transition to ecological system, we are making the shift. Then means democracy is also making shift to ecological democracy. Then we need to have a new system, and that new system can be found and rooted in the biocracy. So, according to the concept of Thomas Berry, biocracy engage a lot of the best ecosystems when human beings make decisions. And this importance of nature in human history has already been recognized through the World Charter for Nature in 1982. But the biocracy is not familiar to the modern civilization. So the thing is that how we can expand the biocracy. So way of thought, and the interest are largely shaped in the representative democracy. So it may not be easy to make that shift. So conceptually, the biocracy and the concept of epistemic community will help us adapt to the biocracy and understand biocracy. So biocracy is an essential to understand, to engage the nature, to be in the decision-making process. And to understand the whole process, we have to have some epistemological perspective. That's the idea suggested by Dr. Peter Haas in 1992. And this idea has been suggested based on open source platform. So that is my suggestion for today. So the epistemic community means that it share the same value of the word based on the platform. So the group of experts producing authoritative policy-oriented knowledge while sharing the same interpretation, value, and worldview of phenomena will be the epistemic community. One good example can be people force. So in the process of understanding and solving technical and complex problems, the policymakers and ordinary citizens rely on a group of experts who provide the necessary authoritative knowledge. And the biocracy and epistemic community serve as a provider of information and data required to achieve biocracy. So when it comes to the climate change and COVID-19, it's not limited to Korea, but the ubiquitous issue for the whole world. So the epistemic community in every nation, every country can work together. So these things can be an opportunity for us to activate the epistemic community. So all in all, the biocracy at the global level can be expanded from the epistemic community perspective. If they build a network at the global level to set out some policy framework, we can expand and introduce the biocracy concept in earnest. To sum it up, biocracy is a new alternative to the modern representative system of democracy, and the biocracy emerged as an epistemic community in the early stages of ecological civilization. And in the ancient time, there were citizens and the laborers or slavers. And we, in the modern area, we expand the human rights to include the slaves and the laborers. But in the future, we even expand the boundaries to include natures or more than human communities as well. So in this conference, the biocracy should be understood in the epistemic community. I strongly suggest the biocracy should be adopted at the UN agency. That's it. Thank you.
감사합니다. 지금 시간이
Thank you very much. It's 5 o'clock exactly, and at 5:30 there is another session, and there should be a rehearsal for the session. So unfortunately, that we will have very limited time for Q&A session. You will see the live chatting window. Then the question goes to Professor Butzelman. And we have received 5 questions registered previously. And while listening to the presentation, I think some of the questions have been covered. And one question goes here from Nepal.
development initiatives be made sustainable without disrupting nature as well as people-to-people contact? 이렇게 질문을 주셨습니다. 우리 세션 주제에 디벨롭먼트가 있었는데 사실 이제 그 부분에 대한 논의는
In our session, subject that there was a development. However, we didn't have much time to talk about development. And we have received many suggestions. But the residents who leave the DMZ, they would think that they are refrained from further development or economic growth. Then we have to think as NGOs and as also governments how to support these locals near the DMZ. And this is one of the subjects that we have to think together. So that's one question. And the other one is this.
There are many different proposals, and we need to make the shift of way of thinking. But diverse approaches and strategies are good, but in the big way, we have to cover the humans and non-human, the living inside of that, and also we have to consider the people who are human beings but not showing some behavior like a human being level. So we have to help them to act appropriately to the current situation. That's kind of awareness that we are having widely. So I just, as a moderator, failed to keep the time. Failed to having the timekeeping work, so I feel a little sorry not to give you enough time. But we're gonna have many more sessions after this session 4. So I want all of you can make discussions in the following sessions as well to find another chance to give you the answers. So it's a shame, but we need to wrap it up this session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Professor Tong-Sok Oh, thank you very much for moderating session 4, and to all the 6 presenters for sharing your valuable knowledge with us. We're now going to move on to session 5 in about half an hour, which gives us a little bit of time for a bit of coffee, tea, stretching your legs. The topic will be sustainable development and transformation in Borderlands. We'll be seeing you in about half an hour. That's 5:30 p.m. Korea Standard Time and 8:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. We hope to see you in a little while.